The roots of resilience. The sun rose slowly over the horizon, casting a warm golden glow over the fields of Samuel Hayes' family farm. At 72 years old, Samuel had lived a quiet and steady life, tending to the land that had been passed down through 3 generations. His hands, calloused and weathered from decades of hard labor, moved expertly through the rows of crops, checking on the sprouting vegetables, as though each plant was an old friend. Samuel took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of fresh earth mixed with the sharpness of the dew. This land had been a constant in his life, a source of pride and stability. His father had taught him how to plow these fields, and his grandfather before him had taught his father. For Samuel, this land wasn't just property. It was a symbol of their survival, their strength, and their resilience against the odds. As he worked, the familiar sounds of the farm brought him comfort. The soft rustle of wind through the corn stalks, the distant call of a rooster from a neighboring farm, and the occasional chirp of crickets waking up to the morning sun. Samuel felt the weight of his age in his bones, but his spirit remained as strong as the soil beneath his feet. He had raised a family here. His wife, Clarice, had been the heart of their home, and though she had passed 10 years ago, her presence still lingered in every corner of the farmhouse. Samuel's son, Elijah, had left for the city years ago, determined to make a life beyond the farm. Elijah had become an FBI agent, a fact Samuel rarely spoke of to anyone in town. It wasn't out of pride or secrecy. It was simply Samuel's way. He believed in hard work and humility, values that had been instilled in him from childhood. He was proud of his son, of course, but he didn't need to boast about it. The town already knew too much about him, and he preferred to keep things quiet. As Samuel climbed onto his old tractor, preparing to plow the south field, a shadow crossed the path in front of him. He glanced up to see a police cruiser, its lights off but unmistakable in the morning light. 2 officers stepped out, their movements casual but purposeful. Samuel's gut instinct told him something wasn't right. The lead officer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face, adjusted his belt and walked toward Samuel. His name was Officer Peterson, a familiar face in town, but not one that Samuel had ever had much contact with. The second officer, younger and more eager, followed closely, holding a clipboard like a weapon. "Mornin', Mr. Hayes," Officer Peterson greeted, tipping his hat slightly but without sincerity. "Beautiful day for a farm inspection, wouldn't you say?" Samuel frowned, his hands tightening on the wheel of the tractor. "Didn't know farms needed inspecting like this," he replied evenly, eyeing the clipboard in the younger officer's hands. "Everything's in order as far as I know." Officer Peterson chuckled, a sound that grated on Samuel's nerves. "Well, that's what we're here to make sure of. You know how it is. Safety codes, zoning regulations, all that good stuff. We wouldn't want anything to happen to this fine property, now would we?" Samuel climbed down from the tractor, his body moving slower than it used to, but his mind as sharp as ever. "I've been working this land for over 50 years. Never had a problem with any of those things." Peterson's smile faded slightly, replaced by a hard look that made Samuel's skin crawl. "Times change, Mr. Hayes, and so do the rules. We've had a few complaints about your property recently. Looks like you're not quite up to code." "Complaints," Samuel repeated, his brow furrowing. He had always kept his farm in perfect condition, meticulous with every detail. The notion that someone would complain about his farm seemed absurd. "Just routine stuff," the younger officer, Davis, chimed in, flipping through his clipboard. "Fencing's too close to the road, and we noticed your barn doesn't have the proper fire suppression systems. Not to mention, that old tractor of yours might not meet emission standards anymore." Samuel's jaw clenched as he listened to the litany of supposed violations. None of it made sense. His fencing had been there since before the town had paved the road. His barn was as solid as it had ever been, and his tractor, while old, ran perfectly fine. This wasn't an inspection. This was something else. "I've kept this farm up to standard for years," Samuel said, his voice calm but firm. "What's really going on here?" Officer Peterson stepped closer, his tone shifting to one of veiled menace. "Let's just say, things around here are changing. We wouldn't want you to fall behind, now would we? We're just trying to make sure you stay ahead of the curve. Course, if you don't want any trouble, we could work something out." Samuel's eyes narrowed. He had seen this tactic before. Small-town corruption dressed up as concern. "What do you mean by work something out?" Peterson grinned, all teeth and no warmth. "Let's just say, a little contribution to keep things smooth around here wouldn't go unnoticed. $2,000 should be enough to cover those fines for now. And maybe you throw in a little extra. We'll make sure you don't have to worry about any more of these inspections." Samuel felt a surge of anger rise in his chest, but he kept his expression neutral. He had been through worse than this in his life, and he wasn't about to be bullied by a couple of dirty cops. "I don't have that kind of money," he said, keeping his voice steady. "And even if I did, I wouldn't give it to you." Peterson's smile vanished, replaced by a look of cold calculation. "That's so. Well, maybe you should think it over. We'll be back in a few days to check on things. Would hate to see a good farm like this go under because of a few minor infractions." With that, the officers turned and walked back to their cruiser, leaving Samuel standing in the dust of his driveway. He watched them drive away, his fists clenched at his sides. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to take a deep breath. The farm was all he had left. It was his life's work, his legacy, and the thought of losing it to corruption made his blood boil. But Samuel wasn't the kind of man to take things lying down. He had survived too much to be intimidated now. And what these officers didn't know was that Samuel had something they hadn't counted on: a son who knew the law better than anyone in town. As Samuel turned back toward his fields, his mind was already racing, thinking of how he would handle the situation. He wouldn't involve Elijah just yet. He wanted to protect his son from this mess if he could. But deep down, Samuel knew this was a fight he couldn't win on his own. And as the sun continued its climb into the sky, Samuel Hayes resolved that he would not let this be the end of his family's legacy. Not now. Not ever. The unseen threats. Samuel Hayes had spent the rest of the day tending to his crops, his hands working with the same precision they had for decades. But the comfort he usually found in the rhythmic labor of farm work was absent. His mind kept drifting back to the morning encounter with Officers Peterson and Davis. Their threats lingered in his mind, unsettling him in ways that no natural disaster or farming hardship ever had. This wasn't about a broken fence or a faulty barn. It was about something far more sinister. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields, Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow and headed back toward the farmhouse. His feet dragged a bit more than usual, the weight of the day pressing down on his shoulders. He wasn't just tired from work. He was tired from carrying the burden of uncertainty. He'd always been able to count on his farm, but now it felt like the land beneath him was shifting in ways he couldn't control. The farmhouse, though modest, was a beacon of warmth and history. Every crack in the floorboards, every faded photograph hanging on the walls, held memories of a life well lived. His late wife, Clarice, had always made sure their home was a sanctuary, a place where love and laughter ruled, even when times were tough. Samuel could almost hear her voice now, as if she were still standing beside him, offering her quiet wisdom. As he stepped through the door, the familiar creak of the wooden floor underfoot brought a momentary sense of comfort. He walked through the small but cozy living room, glancing at the family photos on the mantel. There was one picture in particular that always gave him pause. A young Elijah standing proudly at his FBI graduation, Samuel beside him, beaming with fatherly pride. It had been a long road for Elijah, growing up as a black man in a small southern town with its unspoken racial tensions, but he had persevered, and Samuel had supported him every step of the way. Elijah had always been fiercely determined, even as a boy. He wanted to make something of himself, to rise above the limitations that others tried to place on him. Samuel remembered how Elijah used to follow him around the farm, asking 1,000 questions about everything. The boy was never satisfied with a simple answer. He wanted to understand the why behind everything. That curiosity had driven him to pursue a career in law enforcement, though Samuel had warned him about the dangers that came with wearing a badge. "You know how people see us, Elijah," Samuel had told him years ago, when Elijah first expressed his interest in joining the FBI. "The law isn't always on our side." But Elijah had been undeterred. "That's why I'm going into it, Dad," he'd said, his young face serious beyond his years. "To change things from the inside." Now, Samuel wondered if it was time to ask Elijah for help. He knew his son would want to be involved, but part of him hesitated. This was his battle, his farm, his legacy. Could he really bring Elijah into a fight that could disrupt his career? The FBI was a long way from the small-town corruption Samuel was facing, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. The phone on the wall rang, startling him from his thoughts. Samuel hesitated for a moment before picking it up, expecting it to be another call from one of his neighbors or a vendor. "Dad." It was Elijah's voice, a welcome sound that brought both relief and anxiety. "Elijah," Samuel replied, leaning against the kitchen counter. "How's the city treating you?" "Busy as always," Elijah said with a chuckle. "But I was just thinking about you. Haven't heard from you in a while. How's the farm?" Samuel's grip on the phone tightened slightly. He didn't want to lie to his son, but he also didn't want to worry him unnecessarily. "Farm's fine," he said, his voice steady, but not entirely convincing. "Just the usual." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the kind of pause Samuel had grown to recognize when Elijah was thinking. "You sure about that, Dad? You sound off." Samuel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "It's nothing I can't handle, just a couple of local officers making some noise about inspections. You know how these things go." Elijah's voice sharpened. "What do you mean making noise? Are they hassling you?" "They came by today," Samuel admitted reluctantly. "Said I wasn't up to code. Made some threats about shutting down the farm if I didn't fix things." "That sounds like extortion," Elijah said, his tone hardening. "Did they ask for money?" Samuel was silent for a moment before nodding, even though his son couldn't see him. "Yeah, $2,000 to start." "Dad, that's not something you just let slide," Elijah said, his voice full of concern. "They're trying to shake you down. You need to report this." "And who am I going to report it to, son?" Samuel said, a hint of bitterness creeping into his voice. "The same sheriff who golfs with those boys on weekends. This town isn't like the city. People look out for each other, and that doesn't always mean doing what's right." Elijah was quiet for a long moment. "I'm coming down there." "No, Elijah," Samuel said quickly. "You don't need to get involved in this mess. You've got your own work to focus on." "I'm already involved," Elijah insisted. "You're my father, and they're trying to take advantage of you. I'll take a few days off and be there by the weekend." Samuel didn't have the heart to argue. He knew his son well enough to understand that once Elijah had made up his mind, there was no changing it. But a part of him was relieved. Maybe Elijah could help him navigate this without things getting worse. "All right," Samuel said finally, "but don't go making a scene. I just want to handle this quietly." Elijah chuckled softly. "No promises, Dad, but I'll be there soon." After hanging up, Samuel stood by the window, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the hills. The weight on his shoulders felt a little lighter now, knowing that Elijah was coming. But there was still a knot of anxiety in his stomach. These officers weren't just harassing him for the fun of it. They had a plan, and Samuel had a feeling things were going to get worse before they got better. The next few days passed in a haze of tension. Samuel tried to go about his work as usual, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Every time he drove into town for supplies, he saw the patrol car parked a little too conveniently nearby. The officers didn't approach him again, but their presence was a constant reminder of the threat hanging over his head. One morning, as Samuel was preparing to load up his truck with fresh vegetables to take to the farmer's market, he noticed a figure standing near the edge of his property. His heart skipped a beat, and for a moment, he thought it was one of the officers returning. But as the figure stepped closer, Samuel recognized the tall, broad-shouldered frame of his son. "Elijah," Samuel called out, relief washing over him as he walked toward his son. Elijah smiled, though there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there the last time Samuel had seen him. He wore a dark suit, the kind that made him look more like a federal agent than the boy who had once chased chickens around the yard. But Samuel could still see the same determination in his son's face, the same fire that had driven him to leave the farm and make something of himself. "Hey, Dad," Elijah greeted, his voice calm but serious. "Looks like I made it just in time." Samuel nodded, glancing around the property as if expecting to see Officer Peterson lurking in the shadows. "Yeah, things have been tense. You sure you want to get involved in this?" "I don't have a choice," Elijah replied, his expression softening as he placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "You raised me to do what's right, no matter how hard it is. And right now, what's happening here isn't right." Samuel let out a long breath, feeling the tension in his chest ease slightly. "All right, let's see if we can put an end to this." They spent the afternoon going over the details of what had happened, how the officers had shown up unannounced, the bogus violations they had cited, and the threats of further harassment if Samuel didn't pay up. Elijah listened carefully, his jaw tightening as his father recounted the events. "These guys are playing a dangerous game," Elijah said finally, his voice low. "And they've been getting away with it for a long time. I'm willing to bet this isn't the first time they've shaken someone down." Samuel nodded, knowing his son was right. But this town doesn't take kindly to people stirring the pot. If you start digging, they're gonna push back. Elijah's eyes flashed with determination. "Let them push. I'm not afraid of bullies. And neither are you, Dad." For the first time in days, Samuel felt a glimmer of hope. His son was right. He wasn't alone in this. Together, they would stand up to the corruption that had taken root in their town, and they wouldn't stop until justice was served. That evening, as the sun set over the farm, Samuel and Elijah sat on the porch, watching the fireflies blink in the growing darkness. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine, the same flowers that Clarice had planted years ago. For the first time, in what felt like forever, Samuel allowed himself to believe that things might just turn out all right. But deep down, he knew that the battle was far from over. The officers wouldn't back down easily, and the road ahead would be difficult. Yet, as he sat beside his son, the quiet sounds of the night surrounding them, Samuel felt a sense of strength that hadn't been there before. Whatever was coming next, they would face it together. The gathering storm. As the next day dawned, the first rays of sunlight casting a golden glow over the farm, Samuel felt an uneasy calm settle over him. The air was thick with anticipation, as if the land itself sensed the storm gathering just over the horizon. He had lived through his share of trials, but something about this moment felt different. It wasn't just the harassment from the officers. It was the sense that everything he had worked for, everything his family had built over generations, was under threat. Samuel wasn't a man prone to fear, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. What if this time, hard work and resilience wouldn't be enough? What if no amount of planting, plowing, or perseverance could fend off the forces that sought to take away everything he held dear? Elijah had been up late the night before, making phone calls to contacts at the FBI and reviewing the information his father had shared with him. Even after years away from the farm, Elijah moved with a quiet efficiency that reminded Samuel of Clarice. His son had inherited his mother's calm demeanor, but combined it with the sharp instincts of a lawman. Now, as Samuel stepped into the kitchen that morning, he found Elijah already up, sipping coffee and reviewing a stack of papers on the table. "Morning, Dad," Elijah greeted, his expression serious but alert. "You sleep all right?" Samuel grunted in response, pouring himself a cup of coffee, as well as a man can when he knows he's about to go up against the law. Elijah's eyes softened, but his tone remained firm. "You're not going up against the law, Dad. You're standing up to corruption. Big difference." Samuel took a seat across from his son, glancing at the papers Elijah had spread across the table. "What's all this?" "Records I pulled from the county," Elijah explained, tapping one of the papers with his finger. "Financial reports, complaint logs, property inspections. I've been looking for patterns. And guess what? This isn't just about you. These officers, Peterson and Davis, they've been running this scheme for a while." Samuel raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "How do you know that?" Elijah slid one of the papers toward his father. "There are reports of inspections on several minority-owned businesses in town. Always the same officers, always the same complaints. They show up, claim there are violations, and then demand cash to make the problems go away." Samuel's jaw tightened as he read the document. The names of the business owners were familiar to him. Mr. Chun, who ran the convenience store, the Martinez family who owned a small restaurant, and Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly woman who operated a hair salon. They were all hard-working people, just like him. And they had all been targeted by these corrupt officers. "So why hasn't anyone said anything?" Samuel asked, a mixture of anger and disbelief in his voice. "Why haven't they fought back?" Elijah sighed, running a hand over his face. "Fear, Dad. It's hard to stand up to men who wear a badge. People are afraid of what will happen if they speak out. They think the system is against them, that there's no point in fighting. And until now, there hasn't been anyone willing to take them on." Samuel nodded slowly, the weight of it all settling on his shoulders. He knew what it was like to feel powerless, to believe that no matter what you did, the odds were stacked against you. But he also knew that fear could only hold you back if you let it, and he wasn't about to let fear decide the future of his farm or the town. "What's the plan then?" Samuel asked, his voice steady but determined. Elijah leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I've already spoken to a few people at the FBI. They're willing to investigate, but we need evidence, solid evidence, something that can't be brushed off or ignored. I've been documenting everything, but we need a smoking gun. We need to catch them in the act." Samuel frowned. "How do we do that? They're not just going to walk in here and admit they're extorting me." Elijah's lips curled into a small, grim smile. "No, but they'll come back. They always do. And when they do, we'll be ready." Over the next few days, Samuel and Elijah prepared for the inevitable return of Officers Peterson and Davis. Elijah had set up hidden cameras around the property, carefully placing them in areas where they would capture any interactions with the officers without being noticed. He also had a small recording device ready to capture their conversation when they made their demands. The tension in the air was palpable, but Samuel found comfort in having his son by his side. Together, they worked the farm, just as they had done when Elijah was a boy. Samuel showed Elijah how to care for the crops, how to tend to the irrigation system, and how to repair the fences. It felt good to pass on that knowledge, to share the rhythms of farm life with his son once more. But as the days wore on, the quiet peace of the farm was overshadowed by the looming threat. Samuel knew that the officers would return soon, and when they did, things would either get much better or much worse. On the third morning, the familiar sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the stillness of the air. Samuel's heart skipped a beat as he saw the police cruiser pull up to the edge of his property. He glanced at Elijah, who nodded once, his expression calm but focused. "They're here," Elijah said quietly, standing up from the porch. Samuel wiped his hands on his overalls and took a deep breath. He had faced plenty of challenges in his life, but none like this. As he walked toward the officers, he could feel his pulse quicken, but he kept his head high and his shoulders squared. Elijah followed close behind, staying out of sight for now. Officer Peterson stepped out of the cruiser first, his usual smug grin plastered on his face. Officer Davis followed, clipboard in hand, the same predatory look in his eyes. They walked toward Samuel with the air of men who believed they were untouchable. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," Peterson greeted, tipping his hat mockingly. "We're just here to follow up on those violations we talked about. Hope you've had a chance to get everything in order." Samuel stood firm, his eyes locked on Peterson's. "Everything's in order. All right. You won't find anything out of place." Peterson's grin faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "That's so. Well, we'll just have to see about that. But I'm afraid there's still the matter of that payment we discussed. Now we can do this the easy way or the hard way. What'll it be?" Samuel's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not giving you a dime." Peterson's eyes darkened, and he took a step closer. "You sure about that, old man? We wouldn't want to make this any harder than it has to be." Before Samuel could respond, a voice rang out from behind him. "You won't be making anything harder today, Peterson." Peterson and Davis both turned in surprise, their expressions shifting from smug confidence to shock as Elijah stepped into view, his FBI badge glinting in the sunlight. "Who the hell are you?" Peterson demanded, though his voice had lost its earlier edge. "I'm Elijah Hayes," Elijah said coolly, holding up his badge. "Assistant Director of the FBI. And you two are under investigation for extortion, harassment, and abuse of power." Davis' face drained of color, and he took a step back, but Peterson wasn't ready to give up yet. "This is a joke," he spat. "You can't prove anything. It's our word against his." Elijah smiled, a cold, hard smile that sent a chill down Samuel's spine. "Actually, we can prove it. We got you on camera. And we've got a record of every payment you've extorted from other businesses in town. This ends now." Peterson's face twisted with rage, and for a moment, Samuel thought he might lash out. But before he could make a move, several unmarked cars pulled up behind the cruiser. Federal agents stepped out, their presence signaling that this was far from over. "Hands where we can see them," one of the agents ordered, moving toward Peterson and Davis with handcuffs in hand. Davis froze, his eyes wide with fear, but Peterson glared at Elijah with pure hatred. "You think this is over?" he snarled. "You think you've won?" Elijah stepped closer, his eyes cold and unflinching. "It's over, and you're going to pay for every life you've ruined." The agents moved in, cuffing both officers and reading them their rights. As they were led away, Samuel felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. It was over. The nightmare that had threatened to destroy everything he had worked for was finally coming to an end. But as he watched the officers disappear down the road, he couldn't help but wonder how many others had suffered in silence. How many people had been too afraid to fight back? And how long had this corruption been allowed to fester in his town? Elijah turned to his father, his expression softening. "You okay, Dad?" Samuel nodded slowly, though his mind was still racing. "I'm all right. Just didn't expect it to end like this." Elijah placed a hand on his father's shoulder. "It's not over yet. There's still a lot of work to do. But we've taken the first step." Samuel looked out over the fields, the land that had been his life for so many years. It felt different now, as if the weight that had been pressing down on him for so long had finally been lifted. "We'll rebuild," Samuel said quietly. "We'll make this right." Elijah nodded. "We will. Together." As father and son stood side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Samuel knew that the storm had passed. But the work of rebuilding, of healing, had only just begun. After the storm, seeds of justice. The morning after the arrests of officers Peterson and Davis dawned calm and clear, the air crisp with the freshness that only follows a storm. Samuel Hayes sat on his front porch, sipping his coffee in silence as the farm stirred to life around him. The weight that had sat on his chest for weeks seemed lighter, but a new feeling had settled in, a quiet, steady determination. The fight wasn't over. Elijah had risen early as well, already busy on his phone, coordinating with the FBI and local authorities. The arrests were just the beginning. There would be investigations, hearings, and a long process of uncovering the full extent of the corruption that had plagued their small town for far too long. Samuel watched his son from a distance, feeling a surge of pride and gratitude. Elijah had always been the kind of man who didn't back down from a challenge, but seeing him take on this fight on behalf of the entire community made Samuel realize just how much his son had grown. "Morning, Dad," Elijah said as he approached, putting his phone away for the moment. He sat down beside Samuel, the two of them sharing a comfortable silence as they watched the sunrise over the fields. "You've been busy," Samuel commented, his voice low and calm. "What's the next step?" Elijah rubbed the back of his neck, his expression thoughtful. "We've got enough evidence to prosecute Peterson and Davis. They won't be coming back, that's for sure. But there's a lot more to uncover. It wasn't just those two. There's a network here, people who've been looking the other way for years. The sheriff, some local officials. It goes deeper than we thought." Samuel nodded, though he wasn't surprised. He had suspected for a long time that the rot went far beyond the two officers who had targeted him. "You think the town will fight back?" Elijah's eyes narrowed slightly. "Some will, but others, they've been complicit in this, even if they didn't directly take part. Fear and indifference are powerful forces, Dad. People who've been turning a blind eye for years aren't going to change overnight." Samuel sighed, leaning back in his chair. "People can change, Elijah. It just takes time. And sometimes, it takes a storm like this to wake them up." Elijah gave his father a sideways glance, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "You're more optimistic than I am." Samuel chuckled softly. "Maybe. But I've lived through enough to know that nothing stays the same forever. The question is whether we help things change for the better." Elijah nodded thoughtfully, and they lapsed into silence again, both men lost in their thoughts as the first rays of sunlight painted the fields in gold. The farm, which had felt like a battleground just days ago, now felt like a refuge. But Samuel knew that it wasn't just his farm that needed rebuilding, it was the entire town. Word of the arrests spread quickly. By mid-morning, neighbors began arriving at the farm, drawn by curiosity and concern. Samuel wasn't the only one who had been targeted by the corrupt officers, and now that the news was out, others were finding the courage to come forward with their own stories. Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly black woman who ran the hair salon downtown, was one of the first to arrive. She stepped carefully out of her car, her eyes scanning the property as if expecting trouble to still be lurking. Samuel greeted her with a warm smile, offering her a seat on the porch. "Morning, Mrs. Jenkins," Samuel said, tipping his hat slightly. "You heard the news, I suppose." She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them in her lap. "I did. I never thought. I always hoped something would change, but I never believed it would. I've been paying them off for years, Samuel. Years, just to keep my shop open." Samuel felt a deep sadness settle in his chest. He had known Mrs. Jenkins for decades, ever since she and her late husband had moved to town and opened their small business. To think that she had been living under the same shadow of fear and intimidation for all these years, it was a hard pill to swallow. "They won't be bothering you anymore," Samuel assured her. "Elijah's making sure of that." Mrs. Jenkins' eyes filled with tears as she looked at Samuel, her voice trembling. "You've done something incredible here, Samuel. You stood up when the rest of us were too scared to. You showed us that we don't have to keep living like this." Samuel shook his head slowly. "I didn't do it alone. And you shouldn't blame yourself for being afraid, Mrs. Jenkins. These men, they used fear like a weapon. But it's over now. We've got a chance to make things right." As more neighbors arrived, Samuel could feel the tide beginning to turn. People who had once kept to themselves, afraid to speak out, were now gathering on his porch, sharing their stories, their grievances, and their hopes for the future. The Martinez family, who had been harassed for years about their restaurant's health permits, arrived with fresh tamales for everyone. Mr. Chun, the quiet man who ran the convenience store, came by with his teenage son, offering to help with anything that needed fixing on the farm. Samuel's porch, once a place of solitude, had become a gathering place for the community, a place where people could finally speak freely without fear of retribution. As he looked around at the faces of his neighbors, many of whom he had known for most of his life, Samuel felt a profound sense of responsibility. They were looking to him, not just as a farmer, but as a leader. And for the first time, he understood that standing up for his farm had been about more than just protecting his own livelihood. It had been about protecting the entire community. By noon, Elijah had organized a meeting with the FBI agents who had been handling the investigation. They set up a temporary command post on the farm, using Samuel's dining room table to review evidence and take statements from those who had been victimized by the corrupt officers. It was a surreal sight, agents in suits and ties, laptops open, while the smell of fresh-baked bread and tamales filled the air. One by one, members of the community came forward to share their stories. Mrs. Jenkins told the agents about the thousands of dollars she had been forced to pay to keep her salon open. Mr. Chun described the constant inspections and fines that had nearly driven him out of business. Even Bill Whittaker, a white farmer who had kept his distance from Samuel for years, admitted that he had been threatened with bogus fines if he didn't donate to the officers' retirement fund. As the stories piled up, it became clear that the corruption in their town was far more widespread than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just Peterson and Davis. It was the sheriff, the mayor, and several other local officials who had been complicit in the scheme. They had all looked the other way, allowing the officers to extort money and harass the community with impunity. The mood on the farm was tense but hopeful. For the first time in years, people felt like they had a chance to fight back, to reclaim their town from the grip of corruption. And Samuel, who had always been a quiet man, found himself at the center of it all. That afternoon, as the sun hung high in the sky, a group of volunteers began working on the farm, helping Samuel repair the damage left by the officers. Bill Whittaker and his teenage son arrived with a truckload of tools, offering to fix the tractor that Peterson had vandalized. Mr. Chun's son, a budding mechanic, eagerly set to work on the engine, his skilled hands moving with the precision of someone far beyond his years. "I never thought I'd see the day when the whole town was working together like this," Samuel said quietly, watching the activity from the porch. "It's something else." Elijah, standing beside him, nodded. "It is. But it's because of you, Dad. You showed them that they don't have to be afraid. You gave them hope." Samuel shook his head, his voice soft. "I didn't do it alone. They found the strength in themselves. I just gave them a reason to believe in it." Elijah smiled, a rare and genuine smile that made him look like the boy Samuel remembered from so many years ago. "Well, whatever it is, it's working." The farm, which had always been a place of solitude and hard work, now felt like a hub of connection and community. People who had once been strangers were working side by side, repairing fences, fixing equipment, and planting new crops. It was a sight Samuel never thought he would see. People of all backgrounds and colors coming together to rebuild what had been broken. As the day wore on, the FBI agents wrapped up their interviews, collecting enough evidence to proceed with a full investigation into the town's leadership. They had enough to charge Peterson and Davis, but the corruption extended beyond just the police department. It was woven into the very fabric of the town's government, and rooting it out would be a long and difficult process. By the time evening fell, the farm was quiet again. Most of the neighbors had gone home, but a few stayed behind, helping Samuel and Elijah clean up from the day's work. As the last of the sunlight faded, the fireflies began to appear, blinking softly in the twilight. Samuel stood at the edge of the fields, looking out over the land that had been his life for so many years. It had been a long day, an exhausting day, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something new and beautiful was beginning to grow. Elijah joined him, his hands tucked into his pockets as he surveyed the fields. "Looks like we've got a lot of work ahead of us." Samuel smiled, the lines on his face softening. "That's the thing about farming, son. There's always work to be done. But when you've got good people by your side, it doesn't feel like work." They stood in silence for a while, watching as the fireflies danced across the fields, their tiny lights flickering like stars against the darkening sky. The scent of jasmine filled the air, a reminder of the past, but also a symbol of the future, a future that Samuel knew would be better than what had come before. "Tomorrow," Samuel said quietly, "we start planting again." Elijah nodded, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Together, rebuilding from the ashes. The morning dawned quietly over the Hayes farm, the cool autumn breeze carrying with it the smell of freshly tilled earth. The sense of change in the air wasn't just in the turning leaves or the cooler temperatures. It was in the very soul of the town. For years, corruption had simmered just beneath the surface, and now that it had been exposed, Samuel Hayes could feel the weight of history shifting. The winds were finally blowing in the right direction. Samuel stood on the porch of his farmhouse, his eyes scanning the fields that stretched out before him. They were ready to plant again. The damage caused by the corrupt officers, both physical and emotional, was beginning to heal. The fences had been repaired, the tractor had been fixed, and the land, his land, was once again ready to produce. But the real work, Samuel knew, wasn't just about planting seeds in the soil. It was about planting seeds of justice, unity, and change in a community that had been broken for too long. "Elijah," Samuel called over his shoulder as he watched a few volunteers arrive, carrying tools and supplies. "They're here." Elijah stepped out from the house, a manila folder tucked under his arm, his phone constantly buzzing in his pocket. He had spent the past few days neck-deep in the investigation, coordinating with the FBI, sifting through decades of corruption, and making sure that those responsible would face justice. He looked tired, but there was a fire in his eyes, a determination that Samuel recognized as both a blessing and a burden. Elijah had inherited his mother's quiet strength and Samuel's stubborn resolve. Now both traits were being put to the test. "Morning, Dad," Elijah greeted as he walked over to stand beside Samuel on the porch, taking a brief moment to pause from the chaos of the investigation. "I was just on the phone with the Atlanta field office. The sheriff's going to be indicted. Turns out he was in on this whole mess from the beginning. They've got enough evidence to take down half the town's leadership." Samuel nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the field. "And the people? What about them? Are they ready for what's coming?" Elijah hesitated for a moment, glancing at his father. "Some of them are, but others, well, you know how it is. Some folks don't like change, even if it's for the better. They're scared. They've been living under this system for so long, they don't know what it's like to trust anyone in power." Samuel sighed, rubbing a hand over his weathered face. He had lived through decades of seeing how fear could shape people's lives, how it could make them accept the unacceptable just to avoid conflict. But now, after everything that had happened, he was done with living in fear. "We've got to show them there's a different way," Samuel said quietly. "They've been lied to, intimidated, and silenced. But that doesn't mean they can't learn to stand up again." Elijah smiled slightly, though his face remained serious. "You've already shown them, Dad. You were the first one to fight back. Now the whole town's watching. People are starting to believe that change is possible because they've seen you do it." Samuel looked at his son, a surge of pride swelling in his chest. It hadn't been easy standing up to the officers, knowing that his entire livelihood was at risk. But seeing the way the community was now coming together, people who had once been afraid to even speak to one another, now working side by side, that made it all worthwhile. By mid-morning, more neighbors arrived to help with the day's work. The farm had become a beacon of hope in the town, a symbol of resilience and resistance. Mrs. Jenkins showed up again, this time with her daughter, carrying boxes of food for the workers. The Martinez family arrived with their teenage sons, who had offered to help Samuel plant new crops. Even Mr. Chun, who had once kept to himself, showed up with a group of young men from his store, ready to lend a hand. As the day wore on, the fields buzzed with activity. Samuel and Elijah moved from group to group, guiding the volunteers and overseeing the planting. The rhythm of the farm, planting, watering, and tending, was familiar to Samuel, but today it felt different. There was an energy in the air, a sense of purpose that went beyond the crops. They weren't just rebuilding the farm. They were rebuilding trust, rebuilding relationships, rebuilding a town. "Mr. Hayes," a voice called from behind him. Samuel turned to see Bill Whittaker, the white farmer who had kept his distance for so many years, walking toward him with his teenage son, Jack, in tow. Bill's hands were rough and calloused like Samuel's, but there was an awkwardness in his approach, as if he weren't quite sure how to bridge the years of unspoken tension between them. "Bill," Samuel greeted, tipping his hat. "Glad to see you out here." Bill cleared his throat, glancing down at the ground before meeting Samuel's eyes. "Look, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have stood with you earlier. I've been farming alongside you for years, but I didn't speak up when I should have. I let those officers push me around too, but I didn't have the guts to fight back. Not like you did." Samuel looked at Bill for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "It's not about who spoke up first, Bill. It's about what we do now. We've all been through the same thing, in different ways, but we can move forward together." Bill's shoulders seemed to relax a little, and he nodded in gratitude. "Thanks, Samuel. I'm here to help in any way I can. Whatever you need." Samuel clapped Bill on the shoulder. "Then grab a shovel. We've got a lot of work to do." As the day turned into afternoon, the farm was alive with the sound of laughter, conversation, and the steady rhythm of work. The community had turned out in full force, and the fields were starting to fill with new crops: tomatoes, beans, corn, each one a symbol of renewal and hope. The work was hard, but it didn't feel like a burden. There was a shared sense of purpose that kept everyone going, even as the sun beat down on them. At one point, Mrs. Jenkins stood up from where she had been helping with the planting and wiped the sweat from her brow. "I haven't seen this much life on this farm in years," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "You've built something special here, Samuel." Samuel smiled, pausing from his work to look around at the people who had come together. "It's not just me. It's all of us. We're building something together." Elijah, who had been working nearby, joined the conversation, glancing at the fields. "This is just the beginning," he said. "The town's waking up. People are starting to see that they have power, real power. It's not just about the farm. It's about taking back our community." Mrs. Jenkins nodded, her face lined with both age and wisdom. "You're right about that, Elijah. But it's still a long road ahead. Folks are scared, and change doesn't come easy." "That's why we keep planting," Samuel said, his voice steady, "one seed at a time." Later that evening, after the day's work was done, and most of the volunteers had gone home, Samuel and Elijah sat on the porch, watching the sunset over the fields. The sky was painted in hues of orange and pink, and the air was filled with the scent of fresh earth and the distant hum of cicadas. "Tomorrow's a big day," Elijah said quietly, leaning back in his chair. "The mayor's office is under investigation now. We're going to start taking depositions from local officials. It's going to get messy." Samuel nodded, sipping his coffee. "It always does, son. But that's how change happens. You've got to stir things up before you can clean them out." Elijah smiled at his father, admiration in his eyes. "You've been stirring things up since before I was born, haven't you?" Samuel chuckled softly. "I suppose so. But this time, it's different. This time, it's not just about one man or one farm. It's about everyone. And that's why we'll win. They sat in silence for a while, watching the fireflies begin to flicker in the fading light. The farm, which had once felt so isolated, now felt like the center of something much larger. Samuel could feel the weight of history settling on his shoulders, but for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a gift. The sound of footsteps on the porch broke the silence. Mrs. Harrison, the retired schoolteacher who had always been a bit standoffish, approached with a tentative smile on her face. She had been one of the last holdouts, reluctant to get involved, but now clearly moved by the day's events. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice soft but steady, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything you've done, for standing up when the rest of us couldn't. You've shown us what it means to fight for what's right." Samuel stood up, walking over to her with a smile. "Mrs. Harrison, you've been a part of this community for as long as I can remember. You've done your part in raising the next generation. Now it's time we all stand together." Tears filled her eyes as she nodded, her voice thick with emotion. "You're right. It's time." As the stars began to dot the night sky, Samuel and Elijah sat on the porch, feeling the cool breeze sweep across the farm. The town was beginning to change, and the corruption that had plagued it for so long was being rooted out, bit by bit. But more importantly, the people were changing. They were learning to trust each other again, learning that they had the power to shape their own futures. "It's a long road ahead," Elijah said, his voice thoughtful. "But I think we're going to make it." Samuel nodded, his gaze fixed on the fields. "We'll make it, one step at a time, one seed at a time." And as the fireflies flickered around them, illuminating the darkness with their soft, glowing light, Samuel knew that the seeds of justice had finally been planted. This time, they would grow strong. This time, they would endure. The harvest of change. 3 months had passed since the arrest of officers Peterson and Davis, and the town of Spencer County was no longer the same. The once oppressive atmosphere of fear and corruption had been replaced with something new, hope. It was a subtle, growing feeling, like the first shoots of a crop after a long winter. Samuel Hayes, now regarded as a pillar of resilience in the town, stood at the edge of his fields, watching the golden stalks of corn sway gently in the late autumn breeze. His farm had returned to life, just as his community had. The FBI investigation, spearheaded by Elijah, had dug deep into the town's rotten roots, and what they uncovered was far more pervasive than anyone had imagined. The sheriff had been indicted on multiple charges of corruption, along with several local officials who had been complicit in covering up the extortion racket. The town's mayor, John Patterson, had resigned in disgrace after it was revealed that he had turned a blind eye to the harassment of local minority-owned businesses, quietly profiting from the illegal activities of the officers. But the arrests and indictments were just the beginning. Now came the hard part, rebuilding the trust that had been shattered. Samuel had watched the process from a distance, preferring to keep his hands in the soil rather than in the politics of the town. But even from the vantage point of his farm, he could see the changes taking root. It wasn't just about removing the corrupt leaders. It was about planting the seeds of justice and unity, creating a foundation that would endure long after the headlines faded. Today was a special day on the farm. The town had organized a community harvest festival, and Samuel's farm was the centerpiece of the event. What had once been a quiet place, a refuge from the world, had now become a symbol of resilience and renewal. The fields, freshly harvested, stood as a testament to what could be achieved when people worked together. Samuel stepped off the porch and made his way down the dirt path toward the barn, where volunteers had set up tables filled with food, music, and laughter. The scent of roasting corn and fresh bread filled the air, mingling with the crisp autumn breeze. Neighbors who had once barely spoken to each other now gathered around, sharing stories, laughing, and celebrating the new beginning for their town. As Samuel approached, a familiar voice called out to him, "There's the man of the hour." Samuel turned to see Bill Whittaker walking toward him, a broad smile on his face. Bill had been one of the first to step forward after the arrests, acknowledging his own complicity in staying silent for so long. Since then, he had become one of Samuel's closest allies, working side by side with him to help rebuild both the farm and the town. "Bill," Samuel greeted, extending a hand. "You're early. Didn't expect to see you for another hour or so." Bill laughed, shaking Samuel's hand. "You know me, never could resist a good party. Besides, my boy Jack was eager to get out here and help set up." He nodded toward his son, who was busy setting up tables with a group of teenagers. Samuel smiled, watching the young people work with a sense of purpose. It wasn't just about the harvest, it was about something deeper. The kids had grown up in a town where they had seen their parents beaten down by corruption, where they had learned to be silent in the face of injustice. Now they were learning that change was possible, and they were eager to be a part of it. "Good to see them working together," Samuel said quietly. "It's a different world for them now." Bill nodded, his expression growing serious. "Yeah. And it's because of you, Samuel. You started all this. You gave people the courage to stand up." Samuel shook his head, his voice modest. "I didn't do it alone, Bill. I just did what had to be done. And now it's up to all of us to keep it going." As the afternoon wore on, more people arrived. The Martinez family had set up a grill, serving tacos and roasted vegetables. Mrs. Jenkins had brought her famous sweet potato pie, and Mr. Chun had provided drinks from his store. Everywhere Samuel looked, he saw faces that had once been clouded with fear now shining with hope. Elijah arrived later in the day, wearing his usual calm demeanor, though Samuel could see the exhaustion behind his eyes. His son had worked tirelessly to ensure that the FBI investigation left no stone unturned, and the process of rooting out the corruption had taken a toll. But today, Elijah looked content, proud, even, as he watched the town gather in celebration. "Looks like a good turnout," Elijah said, joining his father near the edge of the field where they could watch the festivities unfold. Samuel nodded, his eyes scanning the crowd. "It's more than I expected. People are starting to believe in each other again." Elijah smiled. "You did that, Dad. You gave them a reason to believe." Samuel glanced at his son, a sense of pride welling up inside him. Elijah had always been the one to fight for justice, to stand up against injustice wherever he saw it. But now it wasn't just about the law. It was about building something that would last. "How's the investigation going?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. He had been keeping up with the headlines, but Elijah rarely talked about the details. Elijah sighed, leaning against the fence. "It's going well. The sheriff and his cronies are going to trial soon, and we've already put measures in place to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again. New leadership, new oversight. It's a start. But it's not the end, is it?" Samuel asked quietly. Elijah shook his head. "No, it's just the beginning. The hard part is making sure that the changes stick. People are resistant to change, especially when it threatens their way of life. But I think we've got a real chance here, Dad. This town can be different. It can be better." Samuel looked out over the fields, the golden stalks swaying gently in the breeze. He had spent his entire life working this land, tending to it, nurturing it. But now, as he stood beside his son, he realized that the most important seeds he had ever planted weren't in the soil, they were in the hearts of the people around him. As the evening wore on, the festival reached its peak. Music played from a local band, children ran through the fields, and laughter filled the air. The tension that had once hung over the town had been replaced with a sense of unity that Samuel hadn't seen in decades. At one point, Mrs. Harrison, the retired schoolteacher, approached Samuel with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Hayes," she began, her voice trembling, "I just wanted to say thank you. Thank you for standing up when the rest of us couldn't. You've given us back our town." Samuel smiled warmly, his voice gentle. "It wasn't just me, Mrs. Harrison. We did this together." She nodded, wiping a tear from her cheek. "Still, you showed us that we didn't have to be afraid anymore. And that's something I'll never forget." As Mrs. Harrison walked away, Samuel felt a hand on his shoulder. He turned to see Tommy Parker, the young shopkeeper who had been one of the first to join Samuel in standing up against the corruption. Tommy's face was filled with admiration as he looked at Samuel. "You know, Mr. Hayes," Tommy began, "when all this started, I didn't think we'd ever see the day when this town came together like this. But you showed us that it was possible. You showed us that we didn't have to live in fear." Samuel shook his head, his voice steady. "I just did what I had to, Tommy. The real work begins now." Tommy nodded, understanding. "Well, we're ready. Whatever comes next, we're ready." As the sun began to set, casting the fields in a warm, golden light, Samuel stood on his porch, watching the last of the festival goers pack up and head home. The sense of peace that had eluded him for so long now settled over him like a blanket. The farm was quiet again, but it wasn't the same kind of quiet it had been before. This quiet was filled with the promise of new beginnings, of a future that was brighter than the past. Elijah joined him on the porch, leaning against the railing as they watched the last car disappear down the dirt road. "Looks like the town's finally coming back to life." Samuel nodded, his voice soft. "Yeah, it's been a long time coming." They stood in silence for a moment, the cool autumn air wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. The fireflies had begun to appear, their soft glow blinking in the twilight. "You think it'll last?" Elijah asked quietly. Samuel smiled, his gaze fixed on the fields. "I think it will, as long as we keep tending to it." Elijah nodded, his eyes filled with admiration for his father. "You've built something special here, Dad." Samuel shook his head, his voice filled with humility. "We all did, and now it's up to us to keep it growing." As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Samuel took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past months lift from his shoulders. The fight for justice wasn't over, but they had made a start, and as long as people like Elijah, Bill, Mrs. Jenkins, and Tommy were willing to stand together, Samuel knew that the town of Spencer County would endure. The darkness that had once cast a shadow over the town was gone, replaced by a new light, a light that came from the people, from their resilience, and from their determination to build a better future. Samuel turned to Elijah, his voice steady and strong. "Tomorrow, we start planting again." Elijah smiled, his eyes reflecting the glow of the fireflies. "Together." And as father and son stood side by side on that quiet autumn evening, the farm stretching out before them, they both knew that the seeds they had planted, seeds of justice, unity, and hope, would grow strong and tall, nurtured by the hands of a community that had finally found its voice. The harvest was just beginning.